So let's implement our error handling strategy. And like I say, we're going to be using exceptions to do this, but let's take a look at what we get at the moment and what we get out of the box with .NET Core. And if I go to my startup class and we take a look at the middleware, what we have at the moment, if we're running in development mode and we get an exception, then what we're currently doing is returning a developer exception page to the client. So if we go to Postman again, and let's click on this delete non-existent activity, and I'll need to give it a proper GUID, otherwise I'm just going to run into a validation error, because our API, because we're using GUIDs, our API is not going to attempt to send a non-GUID to our server because it already knows it's not going to exist if the ID is not an actual GUID. So let's just go and let's use one of our existing GUIDs, and I'll just paste this into the non-existent activity, but I'll crucially change one of the characters. And if I click on send, then what happens is I get my developer exception page, and if we take a look at the preview, then this is the page that's returned from .NET Core. And we get this nice pretty exception page that gives us lots of information about the problem that we've got here. And we can see the line that caused the problem, and we can see that we're throwing an exception if the activity equals null, although the context.remove is highlighted here, but this is where we ceased execution of this particular method. And this is what we get when we're running in development. But what do we get if we're not running in development? What do we get if we're running in production mode? Let's take a look. And if we go into our properties folder inside our API and click on launch settings and just change development to production and just restart our application and go and take a look, and now we're running in production. Let's go and take a look. And I'll just rerun that same request. This time we still get the 500 internal server error, but we don't get any other details at all. It's just completely blank. And that's fine for production mode. But what we're going to look at doing, and I'll just change this back to development before I forget, and I'll just restart the server once again. And what we want to do is we want to have our own exception handling middleware that handles exceptions whether we're in production or we're in development mode. And what we're going to do, even though we're going to be using exceptions to get out of our handlers and return something, we're going to extend our exception so that we can do something with a request. So what we're going to do first of all, and I'll just close all of these tabs down. In my application project, I'm just going to create a new folder, and I'm just going to call it errors. And inside here, I'm going to create a new C# class and call it REST exception. And I'm not entirely sure why this has popped up, so I'm just going to remove it. And what this is going to do is derive from the exception class. And we'll need to bring in system. And what I'm going to do inside here is create a constructor for our REST exception. And this is going to take two parameters. It's going to take an HTTP status code, and we'll call it code. And we'll also pass in an object with our errors, and we'll give this a default value of null. And we'll need to bring in system.net for our HTTP status code. And what we want to do is create and initialize the property code. And we also want to do the same for the errors, so create and initialize property errors. And what our strategy is, I'll just go back to the delete method again. Instead of throwing an exception, what we're going to do is throw a new REST exception, and then we're going to pass in the HTTP status code we want to send back, alongside any error information we also want to pass through. And then we can take that status code and the objects with the errors, and then we can write that into our HTTP error response that we send back to the client. So they won't receive an exception, they'll still get a HTTP error response, a normal one, and we'll handle that in something that we're going to create next, which is going to be our error handling middleware. And we'll take a look at that next.